since you went to all the trouble of waking me up. You must really, really love to test.
Hello, and welcome to part 2 of how I made this Ava Foam GLaDOS mask. This will mainly be the construction of the side here. Again, want to thank Mr. Volt. This is where the CAD drawings really came into play, so please go check out his awesome project. I'll be showing you the second half that I ended up making. Sometimes you'll see the first half in the background. I learned a lot of things, so it makes more sense for you to see the second half. The first thing I did was print out some photos from the CAD drawings, including a completely flat one side. And as I went, I cut it up. So for the second half, I taped it back together. I'm starting with the main back panel, and it's a little bit different on the back side, so make sure that you print out the back side and a few other angles so that you can see what things are different on the front and the back. I'm using 5mm foam here. Since this is the second side, I'm using the back side of the pattern, and it didn't fit all in one piece, so I cut out an extra piece to add to it. Because it's a one-dimensional pattern, the pattern has some overlap, so you have to modify your patterns to include that overlap. There are a bunch of ways to cut circles. I decided to take a compass and put an X-Acto knife in the compass. This made it easier to score a nice line for the circles, and then I went back once I had that nice line with the utility knife to actually cut out the circle. Continue cutting out all the pieces and all the little details. Just using the scissors to try to clean up the tiny holes a little bit. The nice thing about using the compass is you can just measure and then mark the center using the sharp point and transfer it onto the layer below. Gluing the pieces and the layers together, remember, be in a well-ventilated area and use a mask. It's important to make sure the seam is lined up for the flat part of it so that you get it as close as possible. The edges not so much because we're going to grind them off. It's also important to make sure the seam is nice and tight, so spend some time pressing it. Going to use the Dremel to smooth out the edges, get some of those seams a little better, and round off the corners. I highly recommend moving to a smoother, finer grit as soon as possible because it makes finishing a lot easier. The Dremel goes through the foam pretty easily, so unless you're taking off large amounts of foam, you want to go fairly fine. I'm using this finer point tip to try to get into the crevices. It doesn't do an amazing job, but you can't do anything with the barrel tips, so it's better than nothing. I use a spade bit to start the holes and then clean it up later with some sanding or with the wood burner. So now I'm adding some of the detail that occurs down at the bottom here. You could add it with another layer or with some grinding, but I've chosen to just score it carefully with the knife and then open it up with the heat gun. Next, we'll glue the two layers together. Make sure to spread out your glue. Now it's time to make some of these details. Make sure to check the isometric printout for whether or not things are raised or sunken, because the flat printout can't tell you that information. I'm cutting two circles to be the top and the bottom of the cylinder that is this raised wheel detail. Now we're going to attach the two circles with a thin layer of 2mm foam. You have to be a little bit careful when making a cylinder with this thinner foam because it can fall in a little bit, but in general it seems to work fairly well. Sometimes things will seem a little out of order in this video, and that's because I would do things while the glue was drying. So this is the main background for the side panel. When making these cylinders, make sure to take your time, go super slowly, make sure everything lines up and stays nice and parallel, and make sure that you're not pressing the center of the 2mm foam in, or you'll get a non-flat cylinder. I like to leave things long and trim them to size. In this case I over trimmed it, but I'll be able to hide it later. For some of the parts, I used my computer-controlled cutter to cut some 2mm foam out. You can definitely do this by hand. I'm just not careful enough to be this neat and tidy. I've already glued the cylinder that we made earlier on and two of the small detail pieces. I'm also making sure that the part I want to hide is going to go under the tape. I'm using the template to mark some detail holes that I'm going to burn with the wood burner. I've already used the sharp end of the compass to poke a hole where they are. I'm just making sure I can see them. We're going to use this tip to make and clean up some of the holes and detail rivets. Again, use a mask and good ventilation whenever you're melting the Ava foam. You can see the holes that I melted. Now I'm going to use a finer tip on the wood burner to burn the smaller holes. I'm measuring the main circle now. And cutting it just as I've done before. In this case, because we're gluing a lot of things to it, we're going to actually make the edge of this cylinder out of the 5mm foam to give it a little more rigidness. And we'll heat the foam and give it an initial bend before we glue the parts together. I like to cut the end with a bevel to make sure that get a close seam on the outside. I overcut the bevel in this case, so if you're really good, you can cut the bevel perfectly. And we need an internal hole for the exposure parts later. We don't have to be too clean on this because we have a top piece that's going to hide a lot of our errors. Again, gluing carefully and trimming to size. Here I've added the top piece and you can see how it covers up a lot of the transgressions. For the posts, I'll be using a pre-made Ava foam dowel. When cutting the dowel, please make sure that your knife is super sharp so that you get a nice clean edge. These breakable knives, be very careful when you break them because the knife will go flying. In general, it's about 3/4 of an inch for the posts that I chose. Now I'm marking the slot for the tape to go through the center post. I didn't do this with the right side and it looked really ugly. Here you can see how the right side the tape goes around. It's covered up by the decorative piece, but it's still better if you don't have to do that. I've cut a thin 1/2 inch strip out of 2mm foam for the tape. I'm calling it the tape, I'm not sure what it is. It may be a belt or something. Who knows what the designers had in mind. And I'm marking the glue positions. Keep in mind that the glue is going to switch sides as it goes over the various elements. I've also glued on those dowel posts that you saw earlier, and that's what the tape is getting glued to. Apply the glue correctly, wipe it, and you can set it up on its edge because it's long enough and thin enough, and let it dry. Very carefully apply it nicely in the center of the posts and around the center of the cylinder that we made earlier. Here I'm making the circle and crossbeam that's in the center. I'm getting an approximate length and then heating and bending it. And again, beveling the end so that the outside will make a nice clean joint. These are the side connectors. They're notched so that they fit within the center post. You notice I made the centerpiece way too small, so I've just ripped it out, and I'm going to add another centerpiece later that's measured better. A good thing to know is that you can sometimes get contact cement apart if you just heat it back up. So if you can't just rip a piece out like that, use the heat gun to heat it up and then it'll pull apart more easily. As I said earlier, I cut apart the template so that I could cut out the separate pieces. This is just me cutting it apart again so that I can get the last layer cut.
In this case, because it doesn't fit in all one piece, I'm folding it over so that I get a nice clean edge where I can cut the second piece and make it mesh up. Now we attach the big cylinder to the middle, slipping it over the tape so that it makes a much cleaner connection. And we're going to trim the centerpiece so that it fits perfectly at the right height and as snugly as possible. Out of 2mm foam, we're going to cut this little trim piece that goes along the edge. I'm using the original template just to get the right curve, but it's actually just a narrow slice of foam. The 2mm foam cuts really nicely with scissors, so sometimes it's the right answer. Since we're working with the 2mm foam, you want to be super careful and take your time putting this on, because the 2mm foam can really flex out of shape if you're not careful. And you want to get it as lined up as possible on that edge to make it look like it was welded on. Around the centerpiece, there's a whole bunch of little triangular struts, so we're going to make a whole bunch of them. I started by cutting 3/4 inch squares and then cutting the 45-degree angle using my mat as a guide. If you don't have a guide like this, you can fold your own out of a piece of paper. I'm now marking where each of the struts should go on the top. I'm not worried about the marks on the top because it is going to be covered up by the decorative piece. And then I'm transferring it down to where I'm actually going to be gluing them so that I can try to keep it as 90 degrees to the circle as possible. I'm just adding one of the decorative pieces. This is definitely one of the pieces that should have been inset instead of raised up, but it still looked good in the end. And putting the decorative piece on the top, making sure to look at the reference to make sure that I get the orientation right, because it is not rotationally symmetric. Now I'm finishing putting on the triangular struts. Holding the last top plate on are these screw heads, and I just happened to have a bit for my wood burner that looked kind of like a screw head, so I went ahead and used that. You can either hand do the design yourself or possibly even heat up a screw and press it in, but I'm not 100% sure if that would work. Again, going to use the AvaFoam dowel to cut the supports for the third layer. These are a few different heights because sometimes the back layer is thicker in places and not in others. Putting a few more detail pieces onto the center ring. And another detail on the third layer, which is just a circle out of 5mm foam. And on top of that circle is another detail piece. I've also added a detail line that I opened up with the heat gun as before. Now we're going to use the wood burner to add in the rivets that go along the edge. I'm going to mark those rivets through the template using the sharp side of my compass. The wood burner I'm using here is super cheap, so it's good to test whether or not the temperature is too hot or too cold on a test piece of foam before you apply it to your project. Since the temperature does vary a fair amount, you want to be careful as you're working to really pay attention. I'm also adding some details to the tape rods. I don't know what else to call them. And here you can see the finished fake rivets, and then a few more details in the body of the third layer. I'm now applying the supports for the third layer. These line up with those fake screws that we made earlier. This is another case where you want to try to give yourself a little bit of leeway so that you can make everything try to line up as best as it possibly can. Because everything, you are working in foam, everything flexes a little bit, and so it isn't always 100% the way you want it to be. And then glue the belt or tape to the supports that you just installed. And lastly, we're going to add the Aperture Science logo to each side. And that's the finished side. We're ready to paint.
So to paint it, I heat sealed it with my heat gun and then covered it with a few layers of Mod Podge. Then the basic colors I used were gunmetal gray, sterling silver, brushed metal silver, and then a much brighter silver, in this case shimmering silver, for some of the highlights. And then for some of the rust look, I have this copper metallic. Now you can probably get away with any combination of those. Just test out your silvers and your grays, plus some blacks for here in the tape, and then a little bit of blue up here.
After painting, I added some mesh cloth with hot glue to hide my face and trimmed it. And then glued the sides to these tabs that are on the inside of the faceplate. I made a ring out of 2 pieces of 5mm foam so that it could sit on my head properly, and glued that in. I then made the clips that are on the top of the headpiece. And cut a bevel so that they could fold. Cut part way in at a 45-degree angle from both sides. And you want to bevel the edge that's going to touch the chassis, so I use some scissors to just take the corner off. I cut the straps out of black 2mm foam. I didn't want to have to paint it afterwards, so the color here was important. Notice I masked where this was going to glue on so that the paint wouldn't interfere with the glue. I'm simply folding it over, and then I'm going to glue the clips to the end of that folded over piece. Again, not measuring quite yet, I'm going to trim it to length. Here I'm rounding and cleaning up the clips. There's sort of a round part in the middle. And then carefully gluing the strap on, trying to get it as even across the headpiece as possible, because it's going to be really obvious if it's not perfectly straight. I made the mistake here of gluing it on too far because I still have to do the fold. So you'll see me slowly, carefully peeling it back so that I can get enough to actually make the fold and make the clip end up in the right place. And that's the last step.
So I'm happy to answer any questions you might have, so please feel free to ask, and thank you so much for watching.